Not books that sold millions of copies, but books that shaped entire civilizations. The Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. Now turn to one of the oldest stories humanity has ever ent, that nobody knows exactly when it was first told. A story that survived the rise and fall of kingdoms, the collapse of empires, the birth of nations, the invention of writing, the birth of science, and even the creation of modern history itself. The story of a great flood. At first, that doesn't sound unusual. Flood stories exist everywhere. Ask almost any culture on Earth, and sooner or later you'll find one. A giant wave, a rising sea, a warning, a survivor, and a new beginning. But here's where things get strange. Most flood legends slowly fade into mythology. The details become blurry, the heroes become larger than life, and the events become almost impossible to verify. Yet the flood described in the Abrahamic traditions behaves differently. The deeper researchers investigate, the more unusual questions begin to appear. Questions nobody expected. Questions that connect religion, archaeology, geology, and human memory in ways that are difficult to ignore. And the first question is surprisingly simple. Why does this story contain so much information? Think about it. Most myths don't care about measurements. Most legends don't care about construction methods, and most ancient stories don't stop to explain design. They focus on battles, monsters, kings, and miracles. But this story pauses to describe a vessel, its proportions, its structure, and its purpose. Almost as if the storyteller wanted future generations to remember something specific, something practical, something important. And that's exactly where our investigation begins. Imagine the world 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. No skyscrapers, no highways, no airplanes crossing oceans, no satellites watching weather systems from space. Only rivers, forests, mountains, and small communities struggling to survive. Life depended entirely on nature. If the rains failed, people suffered. If rivers overflowed, entire harvests disappeared. Nature wasn't something humans controlled. Nature was something humans feared. Now imagine living beside a large body of water. Maybe a lake, maybe a coastline, maybe a fertile river valley. The land is rich. The soil is dark and productive. Fish are plentiful. Animals gather near the water. Everything a community needs is close by. Generation after generation grows up in the same place. Children become parents. Parents become grandparents. The landscape begins to feel permanent. Why wouldn't it? Nobody alive has ever seen it change. Then, one day, something begins to happen. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The earliest warnings are easy to miss. The shoreline looks different. A stream behaves strangely. Groundwater starts rising unexpectedly. Fields remain wet longer than normal. Small changes. The kind of changes people explain away. The kind of changes people always explain away. History shows this pattern over and over again. Before disasters arrive, warnings usually appear first. But warnings rarely look dramatic. And that's exactly why they're ignored. And perhaps that's exactly what happened long ago. Long before historians existed. Long before records were written. Long before anyone imagined their experiences would survive thousands of years. Now let's leave imagination behind for a moment. Because there is a real place that may hold clues. The Black Sea. Today, it covers more than 400,000 square kilometers. It touches multiple nations, and millions of people live along its shores. At first glance, it looks peaceful. But beneath its waters lies one of the most fascinating geological mysteries on Earth. For decades, researchers have debated what happened here during prehistoric times. Some scientists believe dramatic environmental changes transformed this region. Others disagree about the scale and the timing. But nearly everyone agrees on one thing. Ancient coastlines once existed where water exists today. And that fact alone is remarkable. Because every lost coastline once supported life. Families, villages, communities, entire worlds. And when entire worlds disappear beneath water, people remember. Not always accurately, not always completely, but they remember. Memory is strange. Ask 10 witnesses to describe the same event, and you'll probably hear 10 different versions. Yet certain things survive. The fear, the shock, the emotional truth. Those things can outlive facts. Sometimes, they can outlive entire civilizations. And that may explain why flood stories appear in so many places. Ancient Mesopotamia preserved one version. The Eastern Mediterranean preserved another. India preserved its own. China developed several traditions. The Americas contain dozens. Australia contains many more. For generations, scholars treated these stories as unrelated myths. Then, researchers started asking a different question. What if some of these stories preserve memories of real environmental disasters? Not necessarily one global flood, not necessarily one single event, but genuine catastrophes remembered by human beings and passed from generation to generation. Suddenly, the stories become far more interesting. Because memory doesn't need perfect accuracy to preserve truth. Imagine describing a tsunami to your grandchildren. Then imagine those grandchildren telling the story to their children. Then their children telling another generation. Repeat that process for 3,000 years. Details will change. Names will change. Locations may change. But the core event may survive. Water came. People died. Some escaped. Never forget. That's how memory works. And perhaps that's why flood traditions refuse to disappear. But then another mystery appears. Some ancient accounts contain details that seem surprisingly practical. Not magical, not symbolic, practical. Descriptions that sound less like fantasy and more like observation. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but it does force us to ask questions. Questions historians love. Questions archaeologists love. Questions that make mysteries difficult to dismiss. Because when independent sources preserve similar patterns, researchers pay attention. Not because they immediately believe them, but because repetition often points towards something real, something worth investigating. And that's exactly what happened. As scientific exploration expanded during the 20th century, researchers began studying ancient coastlines all over the world. What they discovered was astonishing. The end of the last ice age dramatically reshaped Earth's geography. Glaciers melted, sea levels rose, coastlines moved, entire regions disappeared. Some estimates suggest that enormous areas once occupied by human populations now lie underwater. Think about that for a second. Entire landscapes hidden beneath oceans. Places where people hunted, farmed, built homes, and raised families. Today they're gone. Not destroyed by myth, destroyed by geology. And when geology transforms the world, stories often become the only survivors. Which brings us back to our central mystery. Why did this particular flood story endure? Why did it become sacred? And why did billions of people eventually inherit it? The answer may have less to do with water and more to do with human nature. Because beneath every version of the flood narrative lies the same conflict. A warning is given. Some people listen. Most do not. That pattern is timeless. It appears in ancient history. It appears in modern history. And it appears in our own lives. Warnings are rarely popular. They demand change. They demand preparation. They demand action. Ignoring them is easier, until the consequences arrive. And that may be why this story continues to resonate thousands of years later. Not because people fear floods, but because people recognize themselves. The doubt, the hesitation, the belief that tomorrow will look exactly like today. Every generation shares that assumption. Every generation believes stability is permanent, and every generation eventually discovers otherwise. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because the next part of this story takes us much deeper, into archaeology, into underwater discoveries, into ancient settlements that should not exist where they were found, and into evidence that raises an even bigger question. What exactly happened in the ancient world that left such a powerful mark on human memory? That's where the mystery truly begins. Part 2. The world beneath the water. Imagine discovering a city where no city should exist. Not buried beneath sand, not hidden deep inside a jungle, not sealed beneath layers of volcanic ash, but underwater, hundreds of feet below the surface. A place where people once lived, worked, raised families, and built communities, only to disappear so completely that future generations forgot it had ever existed. For most of human history, that would have sounded impossible. Today, it's reality. Around the world, underwater archaeologists continue uncovering traces of lost landscapes. Ancient shorelines, stone tools, fishing sites, wooden structures, and entire settlements that once stood on dry land. Then, the sea came, and the sea never left. One of the most fascinating places in this search is the Black Sea. At first glance, it looks like any other sea. Ships cross it every day. Fishing boats travel its waters. Tourists visit its coastlines. Nothing about it suggests a hidden past. But the deeper scientists looked, the stranger the story became. The Black Sea is unique. Unlike many bodies of water, its deeper layers contain very little oxygen. And that matters, because oxygen is one of nature's greatest destroyers. It breaks down wood. It destroys organic material. It erases evidence. Take oxygen away, and preservation suddenly becomes possible. In some environments, objects can survive far longer than anyone would expect. And that's exactly what attracted researchers. If ancient settlements once existed around this region, perhaps traces of them still remained hidden below. Perhaps the sea itself had become a giant time capsule. By the late 20th century, advances in underwater exploration opened the door to an entirely new kind of investigation. Remote cameras, deep-sea submersibles, advanced sonar mapping. Technology that allowed researchers to see places human divers could never reach. And what they discovered sparked worldwide interest. Evidence of ancient shorelines. Evidence of human activity. Evidence suggesting that this region looked very different thousands of years ago. Now, to be clear, underwater discoveries do not prove the story of Noah. They do not prove the Ark. And they do not prove every detail found in ancient scripture. Good science doesn't work that way. But these discoveries do prove something important. The ancient world was not static. The landscapes people knew could change dramatically. And sometimes, those changes happened on a scale large enough to transform entire societies. Think about what that really means. Imagine waking up every morning and noticing the shoreline creeping a little closer. At first, it seems insignificant. A few feet, a few yards, nothing alarming. But then months pass, years pass, and the change continues. Fields disappear, roads vanish, homes are abandoned, families move inland. Children grow up hearing stories about places their grandparents once visited but can no longer reach. Eventually, those stories become legends, then myths, then sacred traditions. This process has happened many times throughout history, and it may explain why flood memories appear all across the world. But there's another mystery, one that has fascinated historians for decades. How can human beings preserve information for thousands of years? At first, the answer seems obvious: writing, books, records. But many flood traditions are older than written history itself. They survived through oral transmission alone. Stories passed from one generation to the next. No libraries, no archives, no printing presses. Just memory. And yet, modern research suggests that human memory may be far more durable than we once believed. In Australia, indigenous communities preserved stories about ancient coastlines that disappeared thousands of years ago. When researchers compared those traditions to geological evidence, some of the descriptions matched real submerged landscapes. The stories had changed over time. Of course they had. But the core memory survived. Land once existed here. The sea took it. Never forget. That pattern appears again and again. The details evolve. The central truth remains. Now consider the flood traditions of the ancient Near East. They emerged from one of the most important regions in human history, the birthplace of cities, agriculture, and writing itself. People living there paid close attention to rivers because their survival depended on them. They understood seasonal flooding. They understood drought. They understood environmental change. And if a truly extraordinary catastrophe occurred, this is exactly the kind of society that would remember it. Not perfectly, not scientifically, but powerfully. Strong enough for the memory to survive. Strong enough for future generations to preserve. Strong enough to become sacred. And that brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the Noah narrative, the Ark itself. For centuries, discussions about the Ark focused on a simple question: could such a vessel actually float? Today, engineers can test ideas that ancient people never could. Using computer simulations, researchers can model storms, wave patterns, structural stability, and buoyancy without ever building a full-sized vessel. And when engineers examine large transport ships, they discover something interesting. The safest ship isn't always the fastest, it isn't always the most beautiful, and it isn't always the most efficient. Sometimes survival itself becomes the priority. A vessel designed to endure extreme conditions may look very different from one designed for speed. And that distinction matters, because the Ark, as described in Scripture, was never intended to sail like a modern ship. It wasn't built for exploration, it wasn't built for trade, it wasn't built for war. Its purpose was survival, a floating refuge, a giant lifeboat, a structure designed to remain stable while chaos unfolded around it. Whether you view that description as history or symbolism, the concept is remarkably practical. The goal wasn't navigation, the goal was endurance. And endurance is exactly what disaster survivors need. Which leads to a deeper question. What kind of event creates a story powerful enough to survive thousands of years? Not a seasonal flood. People experience those regularly. Not a local storm. Those happen everywhere. To create a memory that lasts across civilizations. Part 3. The Memory of the Flood. Now the mystery takes an unexpected turn. Because the story doesn't end in the Middle East. It doesn't end with the Torah. It doesn't end with the Bible. And it certainly doesn't end with the Quran. Versions of the same nightmare appear all across the world, thousands of miles apart, separated by oceans, separated by languages, separated by entire civilizations. And yet, somehow, the pattern keeps returning. A warning, a flood, a small group of survivors, and a new beginning. In ancient India, stories tell of a righteous man who receives advance warning of an approaching catastrophe. In Greek tradition, a great flood destroys humanity, leaving only a handful of survivors behind. Across the Americas, numerous indigenous traditions speak of overwhelming waters that change the world forever. In the Pacific Islands, legends describe people escaping rising seas in boats and canoes. And even in Australia, some Aboriginal communities preserve stories about lands that once existed, but now rest beneath the ocean. Different cultures, different beliefs, different continents, yet remarkably similar themes. Now, similarity alone doesn't prove anything. Floods are common natural disasters. In fact, it would be surprising if ancient people never talked about them at all. But researchers noticed something interesting. The closer a culture is to the ancient Near East, the more detailed many of these flood accounts become. The farther away you travel, the simpler the stories often appear. Specific names begin to disappear. Locations fade away. Technical details vanish. And what remains is the memory itself. Water came. People died. A few survived. Never forget. That pattern resembles something historians understand very well: the way memory changes over time. Imagine hearing a story directly from someone who witnessed an extraordinary event. Now imagine that same story being retold for 50 generations. Some details survive, others disappear, but the central experience remains. The edges become blurry, and perhaps that's exactly what we're seeing here. Not perfect history, not pure fiction, but memory, ancient memory, passed from parent to child, grandparent to grandchild, century after century, eventually preserved inside myths, traditions, and sacred texts. And if that's true, it would explain why flood stories appear almost everywhere on Earth. Because at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically around the world. Coastlines moved, islands shrank. Low-lying lands disappeared beneath the sea. Entire communities were forced to relocate. And for the people who experienced it, the event would have felt absolutely apocalyptic. Their world literally vanished. And when human beings survive something like that, they talk about it. They remember it. They warn future generations about it. That may be why flood stories never truly disappeared. But there is another possibility, one that billions of people around the world believe. The Abrahamic faiths teach that the flood narrative is more than cultural memory, more than oral history, more than legend. They teach that it is revelation, a record of real events preserved through divine guidance. Now, science cannot prove that claim, but science cannot disprove it either, because faith and science often ask very different questions. Science asks how, faith asks why. And sometimes, those two worlds overlap in fascinating ways. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. Why does this story continue to matter today? Because whether you see it as history, memory, or revelation, the lesson remains exactly the same. Warnings are often ignored. People assume disaster will never happen to them. People believe there will always be more time, and history repeatedly proves otherwise. The flood story survived for thousands of years because it speaks to something universal: human nature. Our tendency to dismiss danger until it becomes impossible to ignore. And that may be the real reason humanity never forgot. Not because of the water, not because of the ark, but because every generation recognizes itself inside the story. The doubt, the hesitation, the false sense of security, the belief that tomorrow will always look exactly like today. And then suddenly, everything changes. Which leads us to perhaps the strangest question yet. If ancient people were capable of preserving memories this accurately for thousands of years, what other forgotten truths might still be hiding inside the world's oldest stories? Because this mystery may be much bigger than a flood, and we're only beginning to uncover it. Part 4. What if they remembered more than we think? For a long time, modern society treated ancient stories very simply. History was considered fact. Myths were considered fiction. One belonged in textbooks, the other belonged in fairy tales. But over the last century, that line has become much less clear. Again and again, archaeology has uncovered discoveries that forced historians to rethink old assumptions. Ancient cities, once dismissed as legends, were found beneath the ground. Lost trade routes turned out to be real. Forgotten kingdoms emerged from desert sands. Places once believed to exist only in stories suddenly appeared in stone. Now, that doesn't mean every ancient tale is true. Far from it. But it does raise an important question. How many stories contain fragments of real events hidden beneath layers of symbolism? Think about it. Ancient people didn't have documentaries. They didn't have scientific journals. They didn't have digital records. Stories were their archives. Stories preserved history. Stories preserved warnings. Stories preserved identity. When extraordinary events happened, people remembered them through storytelling. The facts changed, the names changed, but the memory survived. And perhaps that's why flood traditions are so difficult to ignore. They appear in too many places, across too many cultures, for far too long. The details may differ, but the message remains surprisingly consistent. A disaster arrives. Most people are unprepared. A few survive. And the world changes forever. Sound familiar? It should. Because humanity still faces the same challenge today. Not floods necessarily, but warnings. Every generation receives them. Sometimes from scientists, sometimes from historians, sometimes from experience itself. And almost every generation believes there's still time, until there isn't. Maybe that's why the story of Noah continues to matter. Not because it belongs to the distant past, but because it feels surprisingly modern. A warning is given. People laugh. People doubt. People delay. Then reality arrives. And reality doesn't care what anyone believed. Whether you see the flood as history, memory, symbolism, or revelation, the lesson remains the same. Listen before it's too late. Pay attention before the signs become impossible to ignore. Because civilizations rarely disappear overnight. They disappear one ignored warning at a time. And perhaps that's the strangest part of this entire mystery. The flood story may not have survived because of the water. It may have survived because every generation eventually recognizes itself inside it. Thousands of years have passed. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have changed. Borders have moved. Yet the story remains. Still being read, still being debated, still being remembered. And maybe that alone tells us something important. The people who came before us wanted this message to survive. They carried it through centuries, across continents, across civilizations, until it reached us. So the question is no longer whether they remembered. The question is whether we're listening. Because history has a habit of repeating itself. Not always in the same way, not always in the same place, but often with the same warning. And the people who ignore that warning rarely realize their mistake until it's already too late. If this investigation made you think, let me know in the comments. Do you believe flood stories preserve real memories from humanity's distant past? Or do you think they're symbolic lessons that evolved independently across cultures? I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this journey into one of history's oldest mysteries, subscribe and join us for the next investigation. Because some of the greatest secrets of the ancient world may still be hiding in plain sight. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop exploring.